Hello and welcome to Lewis and Kyle's show. Today is a little bit different of an episode. Rather than having an interview and a guest on our show, we're going to be interviewing each other about the last year of podcasting. So today, March 24th or March 23rd, marks exactly 1 year since Lewis and I started this podcast. Over the last year, we've had, 60 plus episodes, lots of interviewing, lots of talking to new people, and we thought that today would be a good opportunity to distill what we've learned through learning all of these different lessons in podcasting, in business, and in life.
So the format for this episode, we're going to kind of informally interview each other about what we learned from doing the podcast. We've done a couple of takeaways episodes that are about, each specific episode and the things we learned from that, and then life lessons. And this one we want to be a little bit more tactical, a little less ethereal. And we're going to structure it, instead of each of us coming with, a list of 10 bullet points and we recite our favorite 3, we're going to just ask each other a series of questions that we did not share in advance with each other to see what we think. So Kyle, do you want to start off?
Yeah, a nice little experiment, which has kind of been the theme of our podcast, is just experimenting on an episode and then deciding what was better, either doing it this way or doing it that way. So that's my first question to you, is what minor experiment did we run that had outsized impacts on the quality of our podcast?
I think one that we should resume, that I don't totally know why we haven't, but I could probably come up with a reason, is the ideas segment. So one thing we've learned from the podcast is certain questions lead people to scripted answers, and certain questions lead people to unscripted answers. And the juice of the podcast is really those unscripted answers. There's nothing exciting about hearing a best-selling author recite the thesis of their book that they've recited 1,000 times. That's not differentiated at all, our podcast, from the 50 other shows they go on when they launch the book. Instead, when you ask them something completely unrelated to their book or other ideas that excite them, and just ask them to conduct on the spot original thinking, so I'd say the experiment is 1, the idea segment, and 2, it's just any type of question that is purposely designed to get them off script. And we used to kind of follow the format of like, okay, what's this person best known for? Let's get into that. And that's kind of the opposite of what makes us a differentiated podcast. So that's my answer to that question. You have anything to add there?
And I think that that's actually a good strategy for cold outreach, is reaching out to people and asking them to talk about the things that they don't normally talk about. So I know Blog of Jake, when he reached out to Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, he said specifically, I don't want to have a conversation about cryptocurrency. And you know that Vitalik is getting a offer every day to come on every podcast to talk about cryptocurrency. So introducing the idea of coming on the show about being something other than, their best-selling book or what they're known for, can excite them about coming on the show.
Exactly. I think I have one thing to add there that I'm going to ask you basically the same question, but it's when you go to do that cold outreach or you go to interview someone, if there's a project you can tell that they've worked really, really hard on that they're not getting attention for, like that can be the angle as well for the pitch. Like, what is this? Let's talk about, I know you have your book that sells really well, you have this website, but like, I'm really curious in your one side project that no one ever asks you about. And like that can also be a really tactical and good, right? Like, it's not tactical for the point of getting people to say yes when they wouldn't otherwise. It's getting a conversation that would be better than it would be otherwise, which is a better product for us and the listeners. But question for you is, do you have another specific tactical thing you learned about cold outreach that has made it more effective for getting people on? Like, you're at the beginning sending messages this way and it wasn't all that good, and now you're doing it this way and it's kind of like a little hacky trick.
Well, I definitely still do it a lot. But sentences that start with I think need to be eliminated as much as possible. So I usually start with hello, I am, and then a broad compliment about what the reason that I'm reaching out to them in terms of my perspective on what they're building or their life. Mm-hmm. So I think that what you're doing is incredible because of X, Y, and Z. And then I'll usually say what I would be interested in talking to them about on the podcast. And then at the end is where I give a background. So before, I think I would do, hello, background on the podcast, what we're trying to accomplish, what you and I are trying to accomplish, and then go into, I think that we could build a good podcast together, versus here are all the reasons why I think that you would be a really interesting guest to come on my show. and here's a little bit about us. So that's one tactical improvement that I have made in my cold outreach for guests.
I like that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely more effective, and like, it's like the thing about, you got to put yourself in their shoes, and a reading a paragraph about your podcast is not something that I would be interested in when being invited on a podcast. Like, all of that information is pretty easily found either in a hyperlink to our website or in a quick Google search.
Well,
So
we
it's
want to
like a lot of
demonstrate
that.
as quickly as possible that it's not a generic pitch. And if you start out with a paragraph that doesn't change no matter who we're sending it to, like, right, the podcast is the same podcast just no matter who we're sending the pitch to, which isn't entirely true. Like, I described the show, I might make entrepreneurship
Yeah.
sound like the more prominent theme when we're reaching out to a business owner, and investing the more prominent theme when we're reaching out to an investor. But you immediately start out just talking about something that is specific to them and shows like the level of research and specificity. And then it's just like, oh, by the way, like, this is just a little bit about the show. So that's a good tip. I think in general, in writing, unless you're like writing a story about yourself, like the number of sentences you write starting with I corresponds to a worse paper or a worse article or worse blog.
It's like a direct, like slider. It's like,
Yeah, literally.
if the more eyes, the worse it is.
The less it
So
resonates.
that's a good tip. So my next question for you.
You came up with it, honestly.
Well, you're right. I'm a genius. What tactical advice would you give to someone about to conduct their very first interview?
Is it for a podcast or just for like you're interviewing a person just because you're inspired that to learn from someone?
Let's go with the latter.
Informal, you just want to talk to someone and kind of like learn from their brain.
Yeah.
I think tactical, this is going back to the third door, which we mention often, but pretty much, write out a list of questions so you have them if the conversation runs dry, but then seek to not use them at all. Maybe have the first one ready, because that's an awkward moment as you sit down. All right, what do you want to know? And you're like, everything. Just tell me everything. And then that's going to like not prompt anything at all. This is kind of back to the positive constraints idea. The brain is an amazing question answering machine. So if you give it a specific question, it's going to give you a great answer. And if you just say, tell me everything, they have no starting point, and that's kind of useless. So have like a good specific conversation starting question ready to go, just one. And then that's about it. So when we podcast, for example, I always want to know my first 2 or 3 questions queued up, but then there's always enough momentum after the first 2 or 3 questions that are scripted, rehearsed, meant to invoke a interesting conversation. And then there's always like enough momentum from there. And then sometimes you run out, like they finish a thought, you have nothing you want to say to it. Then you have the list of questions ready, but your goal should be to never use them, because the best conversations are just conversations, in my opinion.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of like, the obvious example is like a snowball, and before the conversation, you're sort of like collecting your things to put into the snowball. And those questions are, ingredients that you can put in there to make it a faster fall down that hill and to gather momentum faster. So
we want to start with some momentum.
Right. But when you write out the questions before, it means that you're researching them. It means that you're thinking about how you're visualizing basically how that conversation could go. And in doing so, you are preparing for that momentum, or you're sort of building it before, right? So that when the conversation happens, you can get past that critical mass quickly and into, that off script sort of like vibration conversation that you want to be having.
Exactly. So my next question for you, just to keep the pace rolling, speaking of all of that, is what was something that was easier than anticipated, and what was something that was harder than anticipated?
Well, something that was, harder than anticipated, I think, was like getting all the equipment together. Like, it took us a long time to get, nice microphones, to get to experiment with the setup with our lighting and the camera. It's like,
there's still work to be done, but
it's not
definitely
great,
better than the start.
but it's like
better than when we started, for sure.
Yeah, it's not great, but it's like it took a lot of iteration, 60 episodes to even get to here, and this is obviously, not that great, and it could be better. So I think that is interesting, because like from the beginning I thought like, oh, well, if we want to start a podcast, then it'd just be easy to get like a perfect, camera, like microphone setup, like done deal. And so that was more difficult than I expected. And then easier, I think a question that I get a lot is like, how do you get people on the podcast? and my go-to answer for that on script is like, one, like there's two sides to it. One, like people are extremely interesting, and if you're reading interesting things all the time, there are people that are creating that. And like no matter what I'm reading, every single time I'm like, wow, person would probably be an interesting podcast. Like I could totally reach out to them. And then two, on the latter half of that is when you're reaching out to people, like people I don't think fully understand just how easy people are to reach. Like maybe not Tim Ferriss and the top of the mountain, but like almost everybody has their Twitter DMs open or their email findable, and like all it takes is one message, and you might not get a reply, and that's okay. But the odds that if you really want to get someone to look at text that you wrote, you can make it pretty high, a pretty high chance that they're going to see it. And that's not something that has always been true, and I think that, or maybe it has always been true, but I don't think that it's fully realized and that people take advantage of it. So reaching out to people and getting them to see what you write is easier, and the actual setup of the podcast was harder.
I would give pretty similar answers there. Again, right, we started this not because we have a passion about audio and cameras and lighting, but we have a passion for conversations with interesting people. And so that part's coming easily. And then the other stuff you have to do, the details you have to work through to enable the second one, is a little bit more challenging.
So my next question for you is, what have been the keys to us not quitting on our podcast?
I think that's something I think about a lot. And I think it's something written down about that. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think one huge one has been a cadence, a sustainable cadence. So one a week is a lot easier to sustain than two a week because it's half as much. And there's just something, nice and rhythmic about, Tuesdays are the days we publish episodes. And that's something that is easy to just fit into the schedule and plan in advance and then work backwards to make happen. I think the partnership accountability, right? Like you're going to be like, Lewis, we're behind. You're going to be like, Kyle, we're behind. And just having that, it's like the same thing as having a gym partner. If you don't show up, someone's going to yell at you. And I think that's good. I think from the start, we've never had 0 listeners. We've always had more than 0. So there's been a feeling that someone is going to like notice and say something if we don't publish something. They're going to be like, hey, I mean, there are people that, again, are used to seeing every single week on Instagram or Twitter, like they're going to say something. They might not even listen to it, but like it just becomes part of their habit to see that we're publishing something. And if it's a guest that catches their attention, the click through is like high enough. But another thing as well, right, is I think we started it for the right reasons. So I think that's been one of the biggest reasons we've been successful in terms of continuing to go and keep going, is that we started it for the intrinsic motivation. So intrinsic motivation tends to be more sustainable than extrinsic motivation. We kind of said, if this happens to turn into money, awesome. If this happens to turn into a humongous following, awesome. But really, the main reason we said is like, there are people doing awesome stuff. We want to be able to talk to them. And we've been able to do that the entire time. And that's only gotten easier with time because, we've learned about pitching, and the credibility we have from the people we've already talked to makes it easier to talk to them as well. I think some external accountability that's been helpful has been, our school has given us a good deal of funding throughout a couple of different projects we were involved in. We did a business plan competition, which gave us like $500, which paid for the first year or so of expenses. Kyle and I both participated in a summer academy where we mentored younger students in entrepreneurship. And we got some nice stipend money for that, which helped pay for upgraded microphones, SaaS software that we use for editing. So I kind of felt like we owed it to them to not kill the project because they were paying us to keep it going. I don't think that was the strongest thing. And then I think at every specific point, right, you and I started saying, okay, let's do 25 episodes and hit 1,000 downloads, and let's decide what to do next. And then we hit that milestone in like the middle of the summer and said, all right, let's do it. Let's continue this through the fall semester. Then over winter break, we said, all right, let's continue it through this semester. So there's been a clear single point, like where you and I have had a strong agreement of like with total clarity, like up until X point in time or up until X milestone is reached, this is what we're going to continue doing. And that clarity is there's no, should we post an episode next week? It's, well, the semester is not over, and we're said we're going to do one every week this semester. So let's keep going. And we've kind of continued to push back that deadline indefinitely. And I also think the flexibility of the show has also been helpful. Like we've made it, we have a niche, but those niches are all encompassing. Like we want to talk to anyone who runs a business, and like we can learn one about the details of that business. So if we have John Shuren from Hydrant and we're just curious about the science of hydration, like that was awesome, even though we didn't really set out to do that. Or we interview someone where the details of the business, like Corsical, for example, were less interesting, like how we built the software that manages the student schedule. Like we didn't want to just ask them all these technical questions. We're just very curious about how we actually scale the business. So I think, there's just endless room for learning, and we're the right people to can keep doing it.
It was a very natural origin story to our podcast. Sort of like we had a group of friends that went out to dinner with each other, and we were like, wow, we cannot remember anything that this like very interesting person said to us, and why don't we record it, or why didn't we record it? And from there it just sort of like grew and bloomed into what it is now. And so that is one reason why I think that quitting has sort of been not an option. And then, like you said, the clear and definable experimentation. Like, I'm gonna make, like Tim Ferriss, I'm gonna make 6 episodes of this podcast, and after 6 episodes, I'm gonna reevaluate whether or not it's something that I want to keep doing. And we've moved back that goalpost as we realize that the value in the last 20 episodes, the value in the last 20 episodes, the value in the last 20 episodes has been so great for us.
So next question here, and I'd say that's one thing I've learned is you just can jump right into the next question. Like you don't notice that as much as the listener of a show, but like sometimes you just jump right into a next question. So what is an annoying thing you did that you saw in yourself and stopped doing?
That's a good question. It takes a lot of reflection to realize what you did that was annoying.
I can give some examples if you want a moment to think of stuff I did, not you.
Oh, I thought you were going to say,
yeah.
Sure, go for it.
I mean, either way, it's a compliment, right? I'm like, these are things that you did poorly in the past that you're doing a better job at.
Right.
But one thing I did was just in the first 5 or 10 interviews, when a guest would just go on for a very long time, because we had some cool people with a lot to say, I would just every 30 or 45 seconds be like,
Yeah.
So that was one thing, like super early on that I caught. Then the other thing is just recognizing I kind of have undiagnosed, medical disclaimer, I don't actually have it, but like total have ADHD. I don't sit still at all. And muting myself when I'm not talking allows me to like fumble and rearrange stuff and click pens and not have y'all hear that very often. So that's 2 very specific things.
Yeah, for me, so I would say stopping silence too early is a big one. I think that a lot of the magic that happens in an interview or when you're talking with someone is like allowing them the 5 seconds of silence between thoughts instead of jumping in and saying your piece in order to, I guess seem smart or to ask your next question that you're waiting to get off your tongue. And I think that stopping silence is usually bad. And then another thing is, in that same vein, just not listening, but rather having something to say. And I know that, I still do this, and it's very hard to not do it. And I try to consciously think about listening rather than thinking about what I want to say. But, I would generally, because when we ask questions, our guests go on pretty long explanations of answers, right? A lot of the time. And throughout that entire, I guess, paragraph and a half or 2 paragraphs that they speak, each point is like something that I could comment on if I wanted to. Like if in isolation, that one sentence is something that I could have an interesting thing to say about. And I think that thinking about that is not the right way to do it. I think that you should listen to the entire paragraph and then formulate your response. And I don't do this as much as I should, or as much as I guess I could. But I think that is, I've gotten better at it. And that's something that was annoying about the way that I was doing it at the beginning. And then I think for the both of us, when we would use Rome to have another conversation on top of the conversation that we were having with our guest, that generally led to us looking not bad, but like, having 2 conversations going on and us talking to each other while our guest is speaking. I think it's rude. And then I'm glad that we stopped doing that.
Yeah. And again, that was about an attachment to the outline and an attachment to getting to everything we wanted to get to. The Rome wasn't for us to chit chat and like talk about other stuff. It was like,
right.
Who's going next? Can I go next? let's bring this, should we ask this question next, or this question next, or this question next? And we have, Rome, you have all these bullet points and you can drag them up and down. So we're like, let's do this one next. And then after that one, this one, then after that one, this one. And we're just like planning the conversation while the guest is just talking, and we're visually distracted, mentally distracted. I think we compensated well. Like, I don't think anyone pointed that out to us but us.
Yeah, no.
But I definitely think it changed the game for the better, like our level of engagement and like, life on full screen, as you call it.
Exactly. Well, shout out David Perel. But so my next question for you, like you like to do, is jump to the next question. Is what low-hanging fruit is there in terms of improvements for our podcasts that are still out there?
So going back to what you said, I think we could definitely we should stand up podcasts, stand up desks, stand up podcasts. I think that's one. I think a better, more consistent pitching habit would make the weekly cadence easier to catch. Like if you and I both did something silly, like every day we send one pitch, we would just have like an abundance of pitches probably. Or if we did, every Saturday we both sent 5.
But that's a problem too, is that we only publish one a week. And so like that is a limiting factor to the number of pitches that we can send, because if, let's say just half of the people get back to us and we send 7 a week, that means that we get, 4 each. So that's 8 weeks of interviews. And you can't interview somebody and release it 12 weeks later. I mean, it just isn't, it's rude, right? Again. So I think that like that is a problem that we need to solve in terms of the cadence of our pitching. Like maybe one every other day, or every 2 days, or every 3 days, or something like that, to where like mathematically it works out to where our bank isn't ever too long.
Yeah. I've not fully thought through the numbers as well, right. But point is like being a little bit more consistent. So it's less of like, there's less, oh shoot, we got to send it like a ton out and then, okay, we're chilling for a while. So just some consistent, semi-optimal cadence of pitching. I think the other thing too is like, willingness to, this is what we set out to do at the beginning that we changed our minds on, was we're going to do one a week minimum. But if we have bonus, we have bonus. That's something we could always fall back on. But, school has just repeatedly become busy. And we've been like, one a week has felt like enough. Where we
I would totally be willing to do more. It's just, we're already busy, and school is. That's one mistake that I think we've both made twice now, is like, well, I was going to say just underestimating the workload required to complete school to the degree at which the two of us are happy with.
Yes. We're very optimistic until the moment hits.
Right.
You can push off the mountain and then all of a sudden you have to climb it. And like, I feel like I don't know how satisfied I am with my answer to that question. I think one thing we've talked about a lot that we haven't done is having a couple questions we ask every guest. So that kind of slowly starts building a compounding resource. So we can like compile that at some point and be like, 50 people's answer to this question. And like that creates cool products, but also it creates something to, the repeatability and the familiarity of segments of like a variety show is something that's pretty well trod in like history of media. And something we could do better is have that repeatability. We do the bonus rounds most of the time and that seems to go well, but like, and there's a lot of questions we ask every so often, but committing to, like Dune from Female Startup Club has her quick 6 or quick 5, and she asked that of every guest, and now she's turning it into a book, but also like something to look forward to at the end. Like, oh, what's this person going to say to this question? And that's like a nice hook for the listener that we have not been doing.
What have you learned about me through our year of podcasting?
That this implies a didn't know before, right?
True.
Is kind of like how I'm interpreting it. So like, what didn't I know about you that I now know about you because of the podcast? That's a very tough question. I mean,
well, yeah, I think, it's, I guess, reinforced. So for you, for me, it's like your willingness, it's like your strong beliefs loosely held, and that comes in the form of like veganism is like probably the best example. It's like you were a vegan and, enough information was presented to you to where you're no longer a vegan. And like,
what did you see in my fridge this morning?
Lots of steak. So, well, like, that's the other side of it is
14 pounds.
You're pretty much consistently on an extreme. and experimenting, and I think that that's awesome. But the breadth of it, I think, is difficult to fully understand unless you are you know, in a relationship like we have where we talk to each other almost every day about things that we're interested in. So like you're always doing something new to a level that I did not understand before we started podcasting.
Okay. Well, I think I have an example for you. Yeah, I'm crazy as hell. That's for sure.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah. One thing for you is that, and this might just be a product of like school being close to home for you and school not being close to home for me,
Hmm.
but you definitely, and this is also like a quarantine type discussion thing, but you always had like a lot more social plans than I did in like
Hmm.
a good way. I don't know, like you see your family, you see your family all the time, and like I don't know about cousins. You don't talk about cousins that often, but like your siblings and your sibling in laws and like the indirect of the indirects, like twice removed and like friends from high school. And a lot of this is just like you're in your existing network and like you can go
Right.
home. But that's something like, you know, I just haven't like being removed from home and like uprooted for a couple years, except for like, the probably 20 episodes I did at home. But like the one, just like how important family is to you. And like, again, that's something I knew, but like, you're just always seeing your family, you're always seeing a friend, or you're
Hmm.
always doing something, which is good. And it's just kind of like, you're still, this is a line from the one thing, like, which I just mentioned a minute ago, but the one thing talks about, do you see life as periods of, as work with occasional periods of vacation between them? Or do you see life as like vacation and life and you just occasionally have to work? And I think I sometimes get sucked into the like life is work, and sometimes I'm fortunate enough to get a break from work, and like
Hmm.
sometimes I'm fortunate enough to not have stuff to do, and like I'll go do something fun. And I think like you're kind of in a better way have that opposite mindset,
Definitely.
that's like fun stuff is pretty much what I'm doing all the time, and then when I need to, I'm going to do work.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And it's like,
And almost to a fault.
by
Like,
default
right.
fun and family and community and friends, and like I think that's a good thing. Or again,
Hmm.
maybe if you think it's to a fault or whatever, but like
I mean, it can be,
the point is like there's
but I
about,
agree.
I'm have spent a lot of time, a lot of
Hmm.
this just being far from home or whatever it is, too far on the one side of the spectrum, and
Hmm.
see you consistently on the other side in a good way.
And I think that you can see that in like the summit that we did, and just how many times I was in the same place. Like, and we
Yeah,
record
you
those,
took like
back to back to
off.
back, pretty much. It's
Yeah.
like I wasn't in the same place one time. I was like
No, you're like, I'm at
doing
this
other stuff.
person's office because we were just schmoozing, and I'm at the
Yeah,
fraternity house, and I'm at my parents' house, I'm at my sister's house, I'm at my brother's house.
I like to keep it moving for sure.
Yeah, and
So
then
I
I
think that
sat in
was
the
a good
same
answer.
chair with the same jersey,
The same chair, the same jersey.
just in
Yeah, that's
between
funny.
periods of other stuff. And maybe that comes back to underestimating school or just not appropriately handling the workload. But that's a separate
Hmm.
discussion. This isn't therapy. But that's one thing I learned about, that putting fun and community higher on the list of priorities while still
Hmm.
getting everything else done. Right.
Hmm.
So,
For sure, and not a morning person. I'm
yeah.
trying to work on that. I think that, and this is something that I wrote recently in a like self improvement like journal, like guided journal. It's just like I think it's a bad thing, first off, and I think that I need to I think that I need to make it to where I have to go to sleep in a certain hour and I have to wake up in a certain hour. Just at some point in that hour, I have to get out of bed and I have to get in bed. And I think that that would drastically improve my scheduling, because it is not good my like back and forth between 2 a.m. 1 a.m. like, but I feel like I'm doing things that are important while I'm doing it, but really I'm not. Like I'm researching decentralized finance, and like I'm like this, but it's just I should probably just be asleep.
Phone in bed. They don't go well. No phone
True.
in bed. Like no rabbit hole media in bed. You know, it's
Everything's
kind
an
of
exciting rabbit hole.
a book. You can just turn the page and like that's kind of your only option.
I think that that is therapy for me,
Yeah.
for sure. All right. Well, I asked the last question, so you're up.
What is an episode that you feel like you learned the most from? And this can either be like,
Yeah. So I have a clear answer to this one.
okay, cool,
Definitely,
no
you know,
constraints
I
needed.
I learned a ton from everybody, but Talger was like, information. It matters when it comes to you, and when you hear it. And so that episode specifically, I learned a ton from, and specifically the idea of like integration and just how like these different pieces of your identity, like they, you know, well, first of all, no consumption matters without integration into your life, and that like the only way you integrate things is by action, either by your thoughts or literally like physically your physical actions. And that was an important lesson to hear. I don't think I've fully implemented it as best as I should, or I will in the future, because it's like always you're continuously learning that lesson, I think. And then, yeah, I mean, that hit me really hard. And then just some of his ideas about like happiness and, you know, uh, your different identities acting in different ways when doing different activities, and how you should let yourself dance, and you should let yourself like be who you are in the moments, without like without judging yourself. And then there's something else that he talked about. It's like the achiever mindset, and just how that does not need to be in every area of your life. And like the achiever mindset, while it's valuable, uh, other things are valuable too. And then finally, I thought a lot about the that framework of thinking back from when you're 80, and thinking about the amount of dollars that you would exchange for a moment of time, and using that as a way to decide what to do and what not to do. So like your fun moments with your family would be worth more to you in on your deathbed than any of your highest accomplishments. And that was like a big framework for me in my head. And then I told him that, and he was like, yeah, but you kind of have to think about it in terms of when you're 30 too. And that blew my mind. That was a huge like realization for me, that your deathbed and when you're 30 and when you're 40 are big, are hugely different perspectives to look back from, and thus you should act accordingly. Those were my big off the cuff takeaways, and what I learned from that episode.
I think the meta lesson is guests who will tell us that we're wrong, or guests who will challenge us.
Mm-hmm.
I have this is a new idea. I spun it up this morning and or last night, but they're the people who, this is completely original, like 100% original, fresh idea. You call them like I call them you'll thank me later kind of person.
Mm.
Someone who's just like ready. So for me, the example that comes to mind is our friend Will Brown, right? Who's like one of the few people I can go to tell me an idea is bad, or just like something I'm doing is lazy thinking, or like I should be doing better. And most people are just so ready to praise you for what you're doing. And like, there's a lot of good reason for that. And I'm not out here trying to not appreciate people who spread positive energy, but he will be like, have you fully thought that through? That's not
Mm-hmm.
a negative thing. Let's just most of our guests, and this also comes back to how we approach the conversation. Like there are some conversations where we treat them like a coaching call, right? We're like, this person is an expert. Let's see if they can help us solve our problems. And like something interesting is going to come from that. And certain guests actually request that you structure the conversation that way. So Evan Carmichael asked us to structure the conversation that way. And like, that's why it went the way it did. And I think Tal Gur also is like a life coach, is how he makes his money or made his money. So that also makes sense that like he was the kind of person that did that. Whereas we're like, interviewing an author, let's just talk about your book. And their book is like about bodybuilding. And we're not trying to turn that into like a personal training session, but
Mm-hmm.
just a huge, huge lesson is that it's seeking the fountain of uncomfortable truths instead of seeking like comforting lies, and just not attacking and challenging your assumptions. So how do we purposely structure conversations that lead us to challenging our assumptions? And this is like what, we talked with Blog of Jake in our most recent episode about his podcast with, what's his name? Kapil Gupta?
Kapil. We probably don't want to talk about that.
I don't want to bring him up, but like we talked about that on air, right?
No. Mm-mm.
Oh, I don't know. Anyway, Blog of Jake did an episode. One of his guests kind of roasted him, and he learned a lot from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not super fun in the moment, but you look back and you're like, damn, we're better off for it.
Right. And I think that that's an important like framework to give advice from. And that's an interesting thing that I've heard recently, is like when certain people are asked for advice a lot, and when they get the request for advice or feedback, they're like, okay, well, what kind of feedback do you want? Do you want me to be nice, or do you want me to tear this apart? And it's like, you should ask that question, but you should pretty much, if you're the one asking for feedback, you should always want them to tear it apart, right? So I think you definitely learn more when you're getting fired on rather than when you're getting praised, no matter what. So yeah, I think that's good. The next question for you is, what negative things has podcasting brought about for you?
Besides, I don't know. I'm trying to think negative
I have
things.
an answer if you want me to
Okay,
answer.
start out. Start
Like the
out.
reason. So for me, it would be like living by the calendar
Hmm.
and the removal of spontaneity because of different appointments I have on a schedule. So, I spoke with this very, very successful real estate investor, entrepreneur guy who was basically like, look, I don't do appointments. Like, just call me and I'll see if like in the next couple of days we can get something together. So like, I think that not having appointments is good, and allows for a level of spontaneity that doesn't exist when you know that next Friday you have a call between 3 and 4. And I think that has often, been a negative thing for me.
Well, I think then, well, interesting. It's like, try to schedule stuff for the middle of the week when you're like clearly in work. But I think a lot of this comes from like school being an inherently you feel kind of free. So like this is the one thing that's not free versus if we were like in a kind of routine career, even as an entrepreneur, right? Just like there's still a predictable cadence that like I get my shit done Tuesdays through Friday and like Sunday through Monday or Saturday through Monday, just screw off. We kind of
Hmm.
like college is kind of a perpetual state of like always kind of doing nothing, always kind of at work, and
Hmm.
work from home only makes that worse. So like this adds a constraint. I was going to say something negative for me is I definitely in the past, and I'm getting better about this, have felt this is like maybe some specific friction between you and I because of our different preferences. Like I've always felt the need to be home. I just
Hmm.
like don't like working outside of home because I'm like, what if like we need to squeeze in this time? If we had an unstructured time to record the introduction or conclusion to an episode, I'm like, for whatever reason, didn't want to leave my house because like, what if we found that availability, that
You
one level
always
of
had that, yeah.
that one like
I
level of
knew I knew this
intersection?
was gonna be your answer.
Okay, well there you go. I thought that's something we learned not to do is you know ask questions we know what the answers are going to be because
Yeah, but we
that's
need
pretty
to
kind of
talk
scripted
about it. I mean,
territory.
we've tried to have that unstructured hour before,
Yeah,
and it got sort of messed up. I think that you just need to worry less about the intro and the outro, or record it right after or before,
yeah,
or well, not before because that doesn't make any sense. But
no, right
um,
after is usually best.
right after is usually best, so that you don't have that pressure of feeling like you need to be at
Yeah,
home.
but that's because in the past we didn't have a cadence for. So in the past 2 weeks we haven't had that issue. Or the past 3 weeks because you've just been coming over to do
Luminita. Shout
workouts.
out Luminita, by the way. If you're listening to
Yeah,
this, Luminita, you've been an amazing intern, and we're really, really glad to have you and to have had you
absolutely,
on the team so far.
absolutely. But I was gonna say slightly separate
Uh-huh.
points. Just you've been coming over throughout the week, and
Uh-huh.
since I have you, we're doing this
Right.
right now. Since you're
Right.
here,
The
there's
X3
something
has
else.
definitely been an improvement for you and I's constant seeing each other, which is good.
Exactly.
X3,
But
big endorsement so far. My arms feel huge. I'm just kidding. Maybe we'll cut
maybe
that
because
out.
you're not a morning person, if we could just say, Friday mornings, or not Friday, but like, a day where you're not going to want to go out the night before. And I'm not going
Hmm.
to want to go out the night before. So it's like
Hmm.
Wednesday mornings
Hmm.
before other shit takes over is like when we batch the other stuff. Maybe we've just, because we always try to like put the batch to figure shit out. Like the batch hour, like this is when we're going to take care of all the small stuff we have to talk to each other about to do, such as the intro
Uh-huh.
outro. You're like, well, I want to be spontaneous because it's a Saturday.
Right.
And then you're like, I don't want to put it at 11 a.m. on a Wednesday because I have class, and I don't want to put it before that because I don't want to have to. Maybe it's just
Wednesday mornings sounds like a good plan. I think that we just made a huge marginal improvement.
exactly right at, and Wednesday mornings are when I meet with Luminita, our awesome intern.
Perfect.
So right after the Luminita, before the X3, which was our 2 episodes ago with Dr. John Jaquish.
Gotta
Humongous
listen to that.
biceps.
Humongous. Well, I think I'll ask you one last question that I've got here. And it's a little bit more meta, a little bit more ethereal, but I think it's a good way to
We,
end
we,
it
we did a
out.
lot of tactical. We really
Right.
did a good job of not letting ourselves
So,
get carried away right off the bat
what advice would you give to yourself 1 year ago
at the outset.
at the outset?
So I'm so tempted to steal answers from the summit because we asked 30 podcast hosts this very question. So like they really covered a lot of ground. So like David Perel, right? Excellent audio equipment from the start. Chris Williamson. This is an interesting piece of advice, actually. Real interesting small point here. Chris Williamson's advice to us was go for A-list guests right off the bat. Like, why sell yourself short? Like, you don't have to, interview 20 middling, like mid-level, moderately successful people before you can start reaching out of your network. But also, I think we did it right. And like, one, all the people within our network we did the podcast with, I think that strengthened all of those personal relationships we have. It's like, I'm super glad that we did that conversation with my cousin, and we did that conversation with coworkers from the past and like other people in our families and communities that like now have better relationships. But that being said, I didn't have to wait as long to start like going for the ambitious outreach either.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think, there's no reason we shouldn't continue if we meet an interesting person who like, isn't a best-selling author or whatever else, or like doesn't have some crazy, and this comes back to like our intrinsic motivation, right? Like the purpose of a guest for us is not their level of clout. Like there's certainly guests that were like, this person has 1 million Instagram followers. Hell yes. Cause like we still do want to grow the audience, but like we're also ready to say this person's never had a social media account ever. They live off the grid in a yurt. Like, let's hear about that a little bit too. But like they're also an expert on something we want to know about. They just happen to like be financing it because they started a DeFi company, but they're totally anonymous. That's like same thing with Blog of Jake, right? Like he actually does have credibility because he's like kind of popular now, but we're just like, this episode we talked to someone named Jake. But it's a good conversation, and we've actually gotten a pretty good amount of positive feedback on it from different people. So point being,
that was a good one because we were I was super interested in talking with him.
A bit of conflicting advice right there. Basically, yes, definitely continue to interview people in your personal network, but there's no reason to not shoot right for the people like high up right early on too. I think another thing, again, right, like you and I just needing to like have some degree of structure that fits our schedule better. Cause I think, we haven't quit, but I think most of the reasons we've been tempted to quit have come from stupid things like friction about scheduling logistics, like just small, like friction over small things. It's, we've never had like large scale creative disagreements, but it's like little bickering about small decisions that like add up over time from a lack of structure for dealing with those things.
I think we're pretty clean slate right now in terms of
I think we're great.
Things.
Yeah. I think I'm just saying like things that caused friction or like potential moments that like were less fun along the way were almost all caused by that.
Right. Totally agree.
I probably got more to say, honestly, but go for it.
Keep going. No, keep going.
I was just going to say, I think this is also lots of hindsight bias, right? Like COVID, maybe we all got bamboozled. Maybe it's really severe. Maybe we don't know. But I definitely could have had a more active social life during the fall semester of COVID than I did. Like, and a lot of that was like, I kind of rationalized my monkhood as like, well, it's okay because like there's COVID, but like it just wasn't necessary to be locked in that much at all. We're in Alabama. A lot of states have different political and scientific opinions than us. But Tuscaloosa, the virus is kind of like, Anyway, I could have had more fun, and that probably would have like
I agree.
Matched a lot of like fun just dissolve stress. Like leaving the house more dissolve stress. And like
you work on a high strung first semester a little bit, just being stressed out. I agree. I think that going out more, just hanging out with people, being outside would have done you a little bit of good, but not, obviously hindsight bias being present here. But
and again, I'm saying like some of the fear of COVID was valid and like
you're right,
but some of it also wasn't.
I mean, we were talking about it before we even started the podcast, COVID. And, we've purposefully sort of not talked about COVID in all of our podcasts. But I think it's interesting to now, looking back, say that COVID was a backdrop on a lot of our conversations. I mean, a lot of our conversations were bookended by either us or our guests hearing, listening, talking about the coronavirus pandemic. And I think that, that's interesting. And I think that probably a lot of the answers and questions that we asked were, they weren't about COVID, but they were painted by the time that we were living through, right? Just like everything is.
Yeah,
So
I
I
mean, it's
think that,
impossible like for it to
right.
not be. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So I think that that's interesting. It's something that we didn't talk about.
Hmm.
Um, and then as to just answering my own question quickly, like what advice I would give myself. This is something that I saw from Jack Butcher recently that I really
Hmm.
liked, and that was just, constant imperfect action. It's
Yeah.
like I would get really caught up about the DMs that I would send to people and be like, well, in a week, if I wait and I can learn more about this person and like what their like goals and dreams are, then like maybe I'll be able to send a better pitch. And like, well, then a week goes by and like I just don't do it. And it's sort of life changes, things change, and it's that moment was gone. And like, if I would have just acted imperfectly and not been so worried about the quality, well, not quality, but you know what I'm saying, just sending it without being worried about whether or not it was worthy of being sent, I think is an idea that is big. You know, it's like if you don't know how to play a game, you don't say no, I don't want to play the game because I don't know how to play, because everybody had their first time at one
Yeah, you
point,
just
and you
play and
should,
do bad.
right, exactly. So I think that that's a big thing that I've learned throughout this last year, and that's the piece of advice that I would give to myself starting the podcast.
Just send the message, and then for me, just leave the house.
Right.
Yeah. Should I ask you a final question? I'm trying to think
Sure.
if I have anything super good here. What's one thing that like you've changed your mind about doing the podcast, a specific interview, besides your regret framing from 80
Hmm.
years? What's like one thing you've changed your mind about pretty substantially?
That's a good question.
Hmm.
It's a question that I'm constantly sort of thinking about. I
Carbohydrates,
think that I
macronutrient.
used to be really. I used to take every person's ideas about anything with the same level of. I assigned the same level of value to any person's opinion about any certain topic. So any person that said anything about cryptocurrency, for example, I would assign the value of that piece of information the same across the board. When really you should be doing it differently, where you consume the information and then decide whether or not aligns with what you have heard in the past and what you believe, and B, whether or not that person is more qualified or not qualified, but like, yeah, I guess I kind of covered it with A, like whether or not it aligns with what I believe, and then being willing to discard it. Because I would sort of let like any piece of information from any person just affect my opinions about things drastically and immediately. And I've changed my mind about that, about doing that.
Well, I think that makes me think of, the litmus test that Dickie Bush talks about. He's like, my 20-year goal is to create a new NBA team. And the people who laugh at me when I say that are the people I want to
Mm,
spend less time with. And the people who say, holy shit, that's awesome. Like, I want to buy in. Like, I know a guy, you should talk to him. Like, oh, my friend's in the NBA. Like, and like
mm-hmm.
they start helping him. Like, that's who you want to spend more time with. And I think that's kind of true. It's like, if you're asking someone who's always a pessimist, or like this is an example from the book The Magic of Thinking Big that like really made me realize something that I kind of observed in the corporate world was, if you ask someone, you ask five different people in your company, let's say three different people in your company, how do you get ahead in this organization, right? You ask the people at your same level, at the entry level, how to get ahead, right? You just chat with your peers at lunch, and people only know how to get as far as they've gotten, pretty much, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
why they're as far as they are. So you ask the guy, he's like, oh, well, this corporation, you always get screwed, and make sure you take credit for stuff, because if you don't take credit for it, you're going to get passed over. And then the guy in the middle is like, really what matters is like, it's probably good advice, right? That's like going to get you to the middle. Then the guy at the top is like, it's all about people. It's all about how you treat people or whatever else. The point is like, don't take advice. Like, I'm not going to ask our skinny guests how to grow
Right.
biceps. Everyone has their own opinion, and not everyone's opinion is valid.
Mm-hmm.
And if you
Exactly.
put too much weight into the opinions of people who it's just bias, right? It's like you kind of have to. I think a lot of it is like a lot of success. This is gonna come out wrong. It's just being comfortable being an asshole. A lot of it is just like, you know, you're basically having a conversation about cryptocurrency with someone who owns $200 worth of Bitcoin and like couldn't explain to you what the blockchain like even means, and like they don't even know what like a distributed ledger is, like just like level like 5 research, and you just have to be like, I'm just gonna tune you out altogether.
Right.
And not feel
and that's
bad
something
for
that I've
doing
never
that.
been able to, or
Yeah.
I never realized, you know, it's obvious when you say it, right? It's
Mhm.
like, and it just, I don't know. It was a lesson that I had to learn,
It
and I
comes
did
back to
learn.
just when you ship creative work. So like, you know, 2 years before we started the podcast, I was writing about productivity, and I had like friends that'd be like, this stuff's boring. And I'm like, it's not boring. I just didn't write it for you. Cause like people that are interested in this found it interesting. So it's like, that's just how you deal with your critics, right? It's like understanding why they criticize you. And it's not usually for a good reason.
So what about you? What's your answer to this question? Then we'll wrap it up.
I think for me, this is something I talk about frequently ish, is like the genius fallacy.
Hmm.
It's like, I think with very few exceptions, the people on the podcast are like, holy shit, that person is so much smarter than me. I can never be that smart. It's just like, no, this person just did high leverage things, made good decisions, had a solid work ethic, believed in themselves. And like, essentially, it comes down to most characteristics of successful people are more within reach than we think, is how I would
I like
summarize
that.
it.
Summer. I like that distillation. I think that's important and a skill that I need to learn more of is distillation.
You worship, I don't think like Elon Musk is super smart and stuff, but like everyone acts like he's 10 standard deviations off the norm. He's like 2 or 3.
You know, I think Elon is might actually be a genius.
I don't think he's a 1 in a billion. I think it's like a lot of circumstance and a lot of like, I don't think Elon Musk would want you to think he's a genius. You know, that's just like it. You sell yourself
I
short by
think
being like,
Elon Musk
is
is really
unreachable.
obsessed with asking the same or asking the correct question.
Do you have to be a genius to do that? Like,
No.
he didn't like solve every engineering problem in his company. He literally just like, how much smarter is he than like Henry Ford, right? He just like surrounded himself with experts, asked a lot of questions, and like didn't take no for an answer, and like
Hmm.
read textbooks to have
Widely
a
and deeply.
first principles understanding of stuff. Like all of that's accessible to people. I don't know. He's smart, right? I'm not saying I'm as smart as Elon
Yeah.
Musk, but I'm saying like he's not that much
Well,
smarter.
when we get
He
him on the
just
show,
has a high
that's
risk.
when
Yeah.
when we get him on the show, we'll be able to tell whether or not he's actually that smart. You know, we'll test him. We'll
Yeah.
me and Lewis will be his defining test as to whether or not the richest man in the world is
The whole
actually a
point is
genius.
you're peddling the wrong narrative. You're spreading media negativity right now. You don't encourage anyone to think big by saying Elon Musk is somehow special and better than us. You
I
inspire
all
some.
I'm saying
You're
is
not going to
that the
inspire. You're not
one
inspiring.
person
No.
that okay, okay,
Who are you inspiring by saying Elon Musk is a genius? Who does that inspire? Who wants to go out and
true.
try to read a physics textbook? If because Elon Musk can do it because he's a genius, but you can't, right? Because you didn't study physics in
Right.
school.
No,
Like,
I see what you're saying. You
yeah,
know.
you're just missing a couple prerequisites. And it's
Hmm.
like you have to spend an extra 6 months getting the math foundation first, and then you can read the physics textbook. And if you have the habit of asking good questions, the point that I've changed my mind about is just not giving any single person like this cloak of being special. Same thing with David
Hmm.
Goggins, right? He's not a superhuman. He's not.
Hmm.
He's not fundamentally stronger than anyone else. He has a set of tactics and a set of skills, and over time he's built himself to be able to withstand more than most people can. But like the better you understand him, the more you realize like it's not a magic trick. And letting people think that software CEOs are magic because they're prodigy coders, like that doesn't help anyone. No, it's never too late. You can figure it out. It's all possible.
I like it.
Uh,
I think you're right.
so
Uh, I think I just changed my mind about that. Maybe perfect.
Elon Musk, not a genius. He's fucking one of the smartest people, but he's just all about leverage and fundamentals.
Well,
Everything's
perfect.
within grasp. Everything's within your grasp. Y'all can be like Elon Musk. A lot of it's luck and circumstance, right? But
yeah, but well, luck is an aspect or a lever in every domain, as Wes KO said. But I think
Always a
that
factor.
is a good place for us to wrap up this conversation. You know, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm really proud of us for getting to a year. And you know,
we still have to make it. We're recording this on Sunday, so we got to make it to
60th
Tuesday.
episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think we basically made it to a year, which is exciting. So, congratulations to you, and thanks for doing this with me. It's been fun.
Absolutely. We'll keep rolling. Go from there.
All right,
should I sign us off? Or
yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm trying to decide how much editing this conversation should have, because they're like
it's gonna need more if you don't sign us off. So just sign us off.
Well, if you enjoyed this far, if you listened this far, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Kyle and I are both very grateful to you for listening to this episode and any others that you have listened to. If you want to support us and encourage us to keep doing what we're doing, to keep interviewing high performers, keep learning ourselves, and keep spreading optimistic media, encouraging you to understand how business people did the things they did, how authors came up with the ideas they did, and how you can use those ideas and stuff like that to improve your lives and investors and all the awesome things that Kyle and I learn about on the show and that you learn about from listening. Please support us by leaving a rating or review on Apple iTunes. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel if you want to see what we look like when we talk. If you're already here, we look pretty similar than actually that's not true. Sometimes I have really short hair, sometimes I have long hair, sometimes I don't have a mustache, sometimes it's too early and Kyle looks pretty tired. But we're on YouTube for people that like video. We're on social media if you want to say hi. Our favorite thing about the podcast is connecting with the people that listen to it and continuing the conversation going. If we brought up an idea that was interesting to you, we'd love to continue to talk about it. So before we forget about it completely with our bad memories, send us a DM, Instagram, Twitter, wherever else, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks for listening. Check out another one of our episodes. Otherwise, make sure you're subscribed, and we'll see you in a week with the next episode. Have a good one.